and welcome back again to the Cultura Animi blog. This week we're talking about Shakespeare. And we're going to talk about Shakespeare in the context of this idea of culture. Kitty cat. Historian Lawrence W. Levine wrote a paper called William Shakespeare and the American People. And one assertion he makes in this is that culture is the product of unremitting interaction between the past and the present. So first I want to break that down just a little bit. In this context, the past is Shakespeare and his plays. The present is the current social, cultural sort of atmosphere in the world. And culture is the result of this. It's how we create Shakespearean productions today. Culture is what happens when we're dealing with things created in the past through the lens of the present. Let's look at this from the historical perspective that Levine gives us. In his paper, Levine talks about how rapid industrialization in the 19th century kind of added to the separation of social classes. Basically, because of industrialization, you had a more distinct upper class, middle, and lower class. In truth, the middle class didn't even really exist before industrialization. So with the creation and distinction of these classes, you had similar things going on in the theater. For example, in the 1800s, there were two pretty famous actors. One of them was William Charles Macready, and the other was Edwin Forrest. Macready was sort of representative of this higher class of what we would call high culture, more sophisticated theater. And Forrest represented sort of the working class and things that were more accessible to the public. And this was reflected in the theaters that they performed in and kind of the way that their performances were. If you went to see a Macready production, everyone was very quiet and polite and kept to themselves and sort of, golf clap. And if you went and saw a Forrest production, people were more loud, more raucous, a lot more talking, kind of interaction with the audience sort of stuff. Now, in this time period, the working class was very hostile to the upper class. So there was both a rift in the culture and a rift in the world of theater. And this rift was so intense that it eventually erupted in an episode of violence where there was a riot at the Astor Place Opera House in 1849. The higher class performer, Macready, was performing, and the working class people sort of rioted against this performance. So this is kind of what Levine is talking about. There's this socioeconomic situation, the rift in social classes, that's totally being reflected in the way that Shakespeare is performed. So we can look at Shakespeare and kind of get an idea of what the culture is like. So Lawrence Levine specifically called the theater a microcosm of relations between the various socio-economic groups in America. That's a mouthful. But essentially he's saying that, yeah, you can look at the way people interact in the theater, the way they sit in relation to each other, the way that they interact energetically, and this can tell you something about the country and culture as a whole. If you watch my first video blog, you'll remember when I talked about the terms high and low culture and how those terms aren't really applicable anymore because high cultural things can be really accessed by anybody. Like, you can see a whole opera on the internet, on YouTube. And if you look at the public's relationship with Shakespeare nowadays, it totally reflects that notion. Shakespeare, while he is considered by many people to be totally irrelevant, just another old dead white guy, he is more accessible than ever. We see his characters played by famous Hollywood actors. With Shakespeare in kind of film form, we can absorb his works in the comfort of our own home, completely by ourselves, without having to interact with anybody. And I think our culture reflects this in general as a whole because we tend to be pretty isolated. So there's almost kind of this tendency to avoid interpersonal interactions. With the increase of communication taking place over text messaging and email and stuff, we kind of make everything as short and to the point as possible. Which Shakespeare is absolutely not. I even remember in high school when teachers would assign Shakespeare, they would direct people to things like No Fear Shakespeare or Spark Notes, which essentially translates Shakespeare into modern English. Which I think actually kind of sucks because Shakespeare is so beautiful. For example, there's one line in the movie Shakespeare in Love that particularly stuck out to me. Shakespeare says to his love, Gwyneth Paltrow, aka Viola de Lesseps, he says, "My bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love as deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite." Like, what? That's so beautiful! He's saying that I have infinite love to give you. It's amazing. I love it. I think Shakespeare's amazing, and his plays are worth seeing, worth reading, worth trying to understand. And it's also cool because we can look at the way we interact with Shakespeare and figure out things about our own culture. I'm gonna close this week with a new segment that I like to call Ask My Neighbors How They Feel About Shakespeare. Thanks for joining me again, and I hope to see you next week.
Like, it's more about the name
Ew.
than...
Just being like, I know who he is, rather
well,
than...
everyone knows who he is.
Yeah.
And it has become more of a... Like, it's more about the person than the actual work.
He's like a symbol.
Yeah, exactly, symbol.
Well, if he's a symbol for something, what is he a symbol for, you think?
Literature.
Just like the
I would
whole of
say,
it?
like romance, you know? Like
Yeah, actually more... that's true.
Yeah.
It's more about... In general, romance, like...
It's fancy romance, that's what it is.
Fancy romance?
Yeah, I'm about that ratchet stuff, so just kidding.